to the Truth Roller Special. My name is Derek Blakey, and the program today is on roots. I know many of you have seen Roots, and probably some of you have read Roots. But what do you know about the author, Alex Haley? And how was he able to find his roots? And how did he start writing? Now, here's the story.
It was literally on this front porch where you see the rocking chairs where my grandmother and her sisters, who were my great aunts, sat. In the evenings, there were thick honeysuckle vines. It's a thick flowering vine here. There was something we call lightning bugs, fireflies, glow bugs that would light up the whole lawn. And they would sit and talk about their parents who had been slaves. They'd talk about their father's father, a man called Chicken George. They would talk about his mother, a lady called Miss Kizzy, and then about her father, who was the African. And I, little boy, sat on this porch and heard them from the time I was, say, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, on up into my teens, until I knew the story about as well as they. You know something? You talk about my grandmother. Now I am age 65. And that lady had me from the time I was 2 months old, here at this house, on this yard and so forth. And today, it is as if my grandmother sits right up here. I don't do everything my grandmother would have me do. I certainly don't. But I don't do anything too far away from what she would have had. Her sense of her is there. Many times, quite literally, I have had a situation come up where I'm not quite sure what to do, and I would simply ask Grandma, today.
In Roots, you're not really talking simply about one person, Kunta Kinte, you're talking about a whole people.
Oh, sure. Right, absolutely. You know, that came to me when I was pretty well into the writing of the book. I was in Africa when I went to a village where the people told me I was the first black American they ever had seen. And I began to realize that I was really a symbol of a people to them. And in fact, it's true. Every black person in this country goes back to somebody who lived in some village, who was somebody's Kunta Kinte, who came to this country on some slave ship, across the same ocean, into some town or city, and then there were the plantations and on up to the Civil War and here today. And so it is indeed the story of a people.
Haley's whole family rests here. His mother, Bertha Haley,
my grandmother,
his grandmother, Cynthia, and her sister, Lizzie Murray.
See, after my grandfather, that's the grandmother.
And here lies his grandfather, Will Palmer, who died in 1926.
Their maiden name was Murray, Cynthia Murray and Lizzie Murray. And then this is the grandfather.
Beside him is his father's grave, George Palmer. It took Alex Haley 12 years to write Roots, to find his way along the threads of family lore and memory back across 2 centuries, to find where he came from, who he was before his family were slaves.
And then, that's my grandfather's mother. And then here is Irene Murray.
This is Irene Murray's grave, the wife of Tom Murray. They were the parents of Haley's grandmother, Cynthia, and her sisters.
He was the father of my grandmother and her sisters. And then here is Chicken George, the world-famous Chicken George, who was the father of Tom.
So actually, Chicken George is the closest step to Kunta Kinte.
You see, as I am the grandson to Will Palmer, Chicken George was the grandson of the African, Kunta Kinte. So that's where it is. Yes, he is the closest step we can get to in terms of where he is buried. I have been to where it is said Kunta Kinte was buried, but there was no headstone. I don't know for sure, but it said that's where the slaves were buried.
You can never enslave someone who knows who he is. Would you say
That's
that
true.
this applies now at large to the black community of this
Oh
country?
yes, I would say that without any question whatever. And the thing is, you see, a whole lot of slavery is not physical chains or fetters. A lot of slavery is psychological. There are many people walking around who are, usually when people talk about slaves, you think about black people. That's because black people were slaves. But there also have been a great many people who were white as sheets who were slaves. And to this day, there are many people of whatever color who are slaves psychologically. They think that they are not free. They think that they are bound by someone and so forth. So slavery is far more than chains. In fact, it might even be more devastating without chains than with it.
Why are there so very few writers, filmmakers, authors, musicians, of course, many, and of great talent? Is music the only cultural legacy within the black community?
It is said, and it's true, that for a long time, probably a century, the two areas that black people could excel in, it was accepted that they might excel in, was music, as you say, and the other was athletics. And we see that to this day, the athletics and the music. Now, of course, we're seeing other things. We're seeing young black people doing things that their parents could not have spelled the word that they are, that their career is in. I just showed you a little while ago, someone gave me a copy of a document where my own literal grandmother and grandfather here in Savannah, Tennessee, my father's parents, literally signed their names with an X because they could not write their names. Now, I write in, at least what I write is in 31 languages. That makes me pause, and it doesn't make me say, wow, how big and smart I am. You know what, my impulse is to fall on my knees and thank God that that could happen in 2 generations. That's really tough to come by. And so I think that that's what we really, I sort of feel that's what we really are dealing with here, is a swiftly evolving culture that is seeing black people able to move out, to diversify, to widen, to do whatever pretty much their capacities permit them to do. Now, it's not all that simple. There are many problems. This is, I think, a country which has lots of blemishes, but which remains the greatest land of opportunity that I know of.
The tales his grandmother told would, in due course, spread to far distant places. For at age 18, Alex Haley enlisted in the Coast Guard. And when the United States entered the Second World War, Haley served as cook aboard a transport ship in the Pacific.
The reason in 1939 was that I was in school at that time in college. I was a sophomore, 38, 39. I was not a particularly good student. It wasn't that I couldn't, I guess, but I just didn't really care that much about school. My professors and teachers used to tell my parents that I was a daydreamer. They were absolutely right. I used to sit in class and make up stories in my head. I could imagine a scene and weep or laugh, as the case may have been. And people tend to look at things like that, to regard things like that as you are off the beaten path. You're not conforming to what you should do. And I wasn't a rebel or anything like that, but my father, who was a conformist, was very unhappy that I was earning poor grades. He was embarrassed at what his number one son was doing in school. And his world was one of excellence as a teacher, and hence his child should be an excellent student. So he decided that I should mature, was his word. And he went shopping for me among the military services. My father had loved his time in World War I as a soldier. And he found that the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps had 4-year enlistments. And there was another called the United States Coast Guard, which had a 3-year enlistment. And he felt that the 3 years was enough. And so, at my father's urging, to put it charitably, I joined the U.S. Coast Guard. And then when I got in, I discovered my dad had done me about the biggest possible favor. The world of a sailor was totally better in every aspect than that of a student. And I was on ships, one after another ship. I shouldn't say it that way, but I was on, over a period of time, a number of ships. And I began to ascend. At the time, if you were black and you went into any of the naval services, that is to say Coast Guard, Navy, or Marine Corps, you automatically became a member of what was called the stewards department. That meant you did, menial work. You made up the beds for the officers. You would shine their shoes. You would do things like this. And then if you advanced, you would become a cook. And I did ultimately well, and I did become a cook. And then I was on a ship in the Southwest Pacific, the AK-95, we called the USS Mersey. And I was a young cook. All day long I'd cook. My high white hat, my apron, and then in the evenings I would go down in the mess deck and get a nap. And I would write letters to everybody I could think of. Particularly I wrote letters to my father's friends at school, extolling what a marvelous, adventurous life I was in. And because I wrote so many letters, and I was writing to people who in turn would write back to you, on the ship I quickly got the image of being the most prolific correspondent. When mail call came, others might get 5, 10 letters, I'd get 35. Literally how I stumbled into being a writer at this moment. I had never thought about being a writer. Nobody could have told me anything. There was no reason I should ever have thought about it. But fellows who knew I got so much mail, who wanted to write girls, began to ask me if I would write letters to girls for them, love letters. I thought it'd be kind of fun. So after I would cook all day, in the evening, I would sit at a table, something like this, with a stack of 3x5 index cards, and my clients would just line up, and I would interview them. I'd say, okay, what's her name? What's she look like? Hair, eyes, mouth, nose, whatever. And I would take little notes on an index card about each girl. And when I had enough notes, then I would take that material about that young lady and try to create a letter to help my buddy's cause. And it would be something like, say, almost all of my clients were white. If a guy told me, say, the girl's hair was blonde, I'd get in some fit of creativity out in the ocean and write something like, your hair is like the moonlight reflected on the rippling waves, like an Italian would write. And then my buddies, when the ships would get in, they would go to these girls who had had these letters. And my buddies began to come back to the ship showing 32 teeth. They couldn't have been happier. They would testify, as only young sailors can, about the great luck and response they'd had. And that was when, and that was how, as a young sailor, a young cook at sea, I began to do something quite by chance that caused my buddies, so grateful for the results they were getting, to begin to voluntarily give me $1 a letter. And I would say within the space of, certainly within the space of 2 months, I was making more money writing love letters than I was making cooking. And that's how I started becoming a writer. That's how I started trying to write for magazines. And that's how I got on that long, long road every writer treads of doing the utter best you can, mailing it out to editors and getting it back with a rejection slip that says something like, thank you for thinking of us, or something like that. And that was my entree to writing. Somehow, when you, quote, make it, the exciting thing is looking back upon the struggle. Now is nowhere near the fun, really, that struggling was. I don't have to worry about, am I going to pay my rent? Hell, I own the house, I don't have to worry about anything financially, but I don't have as much fun, not nearly as much fun with writing as I used to have when I had next to nothing. The story you talk about, I had gotten out of the military. I was scared to death that I wouldn't make it, but I wanted to make this big gamble, full-time freelance writer. I had not really previously realized it, but the military was like a womb to me. It provided, bed and board and psychological comfort and buddies and everything like that. But now all of a sudden here I am out of all this, and I find myself just scared, downright scared. And one day, a buddy of mine called me. He had been in the military too, and he had gone into what we call civil service. And he called me up with quite excited, and he said, look, there's a job that just came available, and you can have it, but you have to accept it right now, because it has to be open to the public at 1 o'clock. And this was in the morning. And he said it was public information specialist. No question I was equipped. I had been in public information in the Coast Guard, plus which you got 10% advantages for having been 20 years in the Coast Guard. I would have had it. And I don't know why I said to him, I just want to keep trying to make it. And he said, look, man, this job pays $6,000 a year. And that was a fortune compared to where I was. And I said to him again, I don't know, I just want to keep trying to make it writing. And he banged the phone down. He was angry. My buddy was. The reason he was angry, in part, was I owed him $15. And that afternoon, I was walking around in this little room. I guess that room I had at 92 Grove Street in the basement, Greenwich Village, was maybe half the size of this kitchen. And I was walking around, and I was just kind of taking a little bit of an inventory of what I had, and thinking how asinine. I had just turned down $6,000 a year. I didn't know when I'd ever see any kind of money like that. And I looked at the place I used for a desk. I had a door on top of 2 sawhorses. You know what a sawhorse is? And the bed I had was also my sitting. It was a little ottoman that opened out into a cot. I remember the brand name was Castro. I had cardboard boxes in which I had paper, this and that and the other. And finally, I came to a little cupboard where I had food. And I opened it, and there were 2 cans of sardines, stamped 2 for 21 cents. So you know how long ago that was. And I ran my hand in my pocket, and I had a dime, a nickel, and 3 pennies, 18 cents. And I remember the feeling was that from here, there is nowhere to go but up. And I just kind of, it wasn't any great dramatic thing. It was just somehow, you know, writers tend to be, creative people tend to be kind of just philosophic and whatever. And I had a little sack, and I dropped the sardines in the sack, and I dropped the 18 cents in the sack, and twisted the neck of the sack, and dropped them in a box. I don't know what miracle took place the next day. I ate, paid the rent, went on, kept going. Or maybe I had to move, I don't know. But it was, I tell you, 6 years later, I had written the autobiography of Malcolm X and sold the movie, the condensation rights, $20,000. I was staggered. And I was sort of going through, jubilant, pulled out the sack. Here is my 18 cents and my 2 cans of sardines, and I had them framed. And they hang on the wall. And they say to me, you must always keep faith when you don't know what's going to happen. You must always believe something upbeat will happen. Now the sardines and the 18 cents are on one side of them is the Pulitzer Prize.
No one will argue that African Americans live as Americans should live in the country which their ancestors, with their sweat and their brawn, did so much to build into a wealthy nation, a heritage they bear for all to see in the very fact of their color. America's whites were for the most part not in any great hurry to share the wealth with their black fellow citizens and had to be nudged and sometimes shoved into an awareness of their obligations. Among the most prominent of the black leaders who saw a new and militant role for African Americans was Malcolm X.
How to register to vote. This is the violence is already there. We are going there to put down the violence. Since the government isn't able to stop the violence that's being committed against Negroes, we feel that it is necessary to put a halt to this violence ourselves. And Lyndon B. Johnson just stated this week that this government would go to war to protect the peace that this government wants. And we feel that our people have reached the point wherein we can see that we're going to have to go to war against the racists in this country and make war against them ourselves in order to preserve our own peace and in order to preserve our own lives and our own property. And this is not advocating any kind of violence. This is being prepared to retaliate against those who are violent with us. And we think that this is the only language that the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and the George Lincoln Rockwells and these other racists and extremists understand.
The very first assignment I got on retirement was from the Reader's Digest to do an article about the Nation of Islam, which is colloquially called the Black Muslims. And the spokesman for that organization was Malcolm X, a very fearsome man of image. And I went to the restaurant which they had in Harlem and said that I would like to see him. And I was talking with a man who was asking me why did I want to see him and so forth. And I discovered later that Malcolm X was listening, sitting behind me in a telephone booth. And at a certain point when he decided that I was harmless, in any physical way, he came out and took up the questioning himself. Why did I want to talk with him? He had a saying I always valued very much. He said, what I want is a writer and not an interpreter. And that was fine. Well, he did the same for me. So we never had a conflict about our religious points of view. I came to admire, to tell you the truth, the man with whom I was working, because I was able to recognize in him that he was carving out new territory. He was carving new ground. His courage, his driving ability to push for what he believed in was just something I had never witnessed to such a degree before. And I became an admirer, and I am to this day an open admirer of Malcolm X, the man.
And I say, I'm speaking as a black man from America, which is a racist society. No matter how much you hear it talk about democracy, it's as racist as South Africa, or as racist as Portugal, or as racist as any other racialist society on this earth. The only difference between it and South Africa preaches separation and practices separation. America preaches integration and practices segregation.
For 2 months, he wouldn't say anything to me about himself. He would only talk about his leader, Mr. Elijah Muhammad, and about the organization, the Nation of Islam. But I was commissioned to write a book about him. And I would say to him repetitively, Mr. Malcolm, we have to have something about you. And I would come back and he would get angry when I would say this. And then came a night, cold, winter, New York, snow up to the knees. And one more time I said to him, knowing that either I got him to talk about himself or I'd have to go to the publisher and say we should stop this, at least for me. And this night, I asked him again. I said, we have to have something about you. And he was angry. He snatched up his coat. He started striding toward the door. He jerked the door open, and I don't know why in the world I said to him what I did. I know I didn't think of it, because you wouldn't have said something like that to Malcolm. I just very quietly said, as he jerked the door open, Mr. Malcolm, could you tell me something about your mother? And I remember he just almost froze. And he turned around, he looked at me very oddly, he closed the door behind him, he began to walk the floor in a counterclockwise direction. And he talked, and his voice was a little higher of register. And he said, it's funny you should ask me that. I remember the kind of dresses she used to wear. They were old and faded and gray. And then he walked a little more and he said, and I remember she was always bent over the stove trying to stretch what little we had. And I'll tell you something, it was about maybe 11:30 at night when he said those things. And that man walked that floor till the day broke. Out of him spilled what essentially is now in the first chapter of the autobiography of Malcolm X called Nightmare. The memory of a little boy of about 7 in a home with his mother who had, I believe, 7 children whom she was trying to hold together, keep together, to keep state social agencies from taking them from her, with her husband and their father having recently been murdered. And she was slowly, her faculties seemed to be diminishing. And this little boy memory of that had stayed in Malcolm all this time until that night. Why I asked him about his mother, I will never on this earth know. But that was the thing that opened him up. From that night, he never hesitated, never was slow to talk about anything about his life. I learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. My older brothers and sister had started to school when sometimes they would come in and ask for a buttered biscuit or something, and my mother impatiently would tell them no. But I would cry out and make a fuss until I got what I wanted. I remember well how my mother asked me why couldn't I be a nice boy like Wilford. But I would think to myself that Wilford, for being so nice and quiet, often stayed hungry. So early in life, I had learned that if you want something, you had better make some noise. And that's that paragraph, which is so characteristic of the Malcolm, the adult.